The US government is using hunger as a weapon, starving millions of civilians. The Donald Trump administration has imposed a medieval-style siege against the tiny island nation of Cuba, and even the Wall Street Journal, which is very anti-Cuba, acknowledged that life in Cuba is grinding to a halt under this extreme oil blockade that the US has imposed. Now, the blockade against Cuba is not new. This goes back more than 60 years. But Trump has taken it to a whole new level and prevented Cuba from getting access to any oil to try to collapse the economy. This means that Cuba has been forced to shut down schools and government offices and public transportation, and international flights have been canceled. And Western media outlets are asking, how long before Cuba collapses? This is the goal of the US government. It is medieval-style siege warfare to collapse the entire country. And when I say the US government is using hunger as a weapon, I'm not in any way exaggerating. This was openly admitted by a US Congress member, Representative Maria Elvira Salazar from Miami, Florida. She is a far-right Republican and a close ally of Donald Trump. And on Twitter, Salazar has been openly calling to starve women and children in Cuba. Again, I'm not in any way exaggerating. This is one of her tweets. She said, the US must deny oxygen to Cuba, to deny every dollar, every trip, to stop everything. No more tourism, no more remittances. And then she added, quote, it's devastating to think about a mother's hunger, about a child who needs immediate help, end quote. She is admitting, without hiding it at all, that the goal of the US empire is literally to starve women and children to bring about total collapse of Cuba's economy and society in order to overthrow Cuba's revolutionary government. It's not just the government that is suffering from this criminal blockade that the US has imposed on Cuba. There are 11 million Cubans in the country, and they're all suffering. This is extreme collective punishment. The peace activist and journalist Medea Benjamin has been in Cuba and writing about her experience. She's been interviewing people in Cuba. She interviewed a mother who's a hairdresser in Cuba's city of Holguin, who said the following through tears, quote, you can't imagine how it touches every part of our lives. It's a vicious, all-encompassing spiral downward. With no gasoline, buses don't run so we can't get to work. We have electricity only 3 to 6 hours a day. There's no gas for cooking, so we're burning wood and charcoal in our apartments. It's like going back 100 years. The blockade is suffocating us, especially single mothers, and no one is stopping these demons, Trump and Marco Rubio, end quote. That is a Cuban mother crying about the horrible crime against humanity that the US empire is carrying out. The US is the most powerful country on earth, and it is doing everything it can to try to crush a small island nation of 11 million people, to send the lives of the people of Cuba back 100 years, to starve them, to try to destroy their country. This is absolutely barbaric and monstrous. And US government officials are gloating about the fact that they are terrorizing the people of Cuba, especially these far-right Congress members from Miami, Florida, who are Trump allies, like Maria Elvira Salazar. They're openly saying, do not travel to Cuba. They want to crush the country. They're boasting that there is no electricity, no food, no medicine, only blackouts and hunger. Not mentioning that that's the intentional goal. They're intentionally causing blackouts and shortages and hunger. And they claim that the regime is in its final hours. They're literally starving as many people as possible to try to overthrow the government. Here I'm looking at a tweet from a Cuban journalist who lives inside Cuba, and he's been talking about how the US blockade has totally paralyzed the education system. He noted that ever since the revolution in 1959, education has been public, free, and universal up to and including the university level. But now Trump's total blockade has paralyzed universities. Literally, the U.S. is taking away the right to study from children and young people in Cuba, directly harming the people. And this is deeply ironic because the U.S. constantly claims to be the richest country on earth, and yet universities are not free in the U.S. They're insanely expensive. There are young people who spend hundreds of thousands of dollars and then go into debt for decades to try to get education in the U.S. So now that the U.S. doesn't provide higher education for free to its people, it's also denying education to the people of Cuba. And it goes without saying that this U.S. blockade of Cuba is obviously completely illegal according to international law. And United Nations human rights experts have publicly condemned this outrageous medieval siege. UN human rights experts emphasized that the U.S. fuel blockade on Cuba is, quote, a serious violation of international law, end quote. And Trump's defenders have been saying, fine, if Cuba can't trade with the U.S., why don't they trade with other countries? Well, because the U.S. government, Trump himself, is openly threatening to impose tariffs and sanctions on other countries and foreign companies that sell oil to Cuba. This is not just about Cuba. The U.S. is threatening all countries and all foreign companies on earth to try to prevent everyone from doing business with Cuba and selling Cuba oil to starve the entire country. And these UN human rights experts emphasized that, quote, there is no right under international law to impose economic penalties on third states for engaging in lawful trade with another sovereign country, end quote. The U.S., again, is a total rogue state, blatantly spitting in the face of international law, clearly violating the sacred principles of sovereign equality, non-intervention, and self-determination, which are very clearly written in the UN Charter. These UN human rights experts warned that the illegal U.S. blockade of Cuba, quote, could lead to a severe humanitarian crisis, end quote. And this is an example of, quote, the collective punishment of civilians, end quote. UN human rights experts demand that the U.S. immediately lift its blockade, but there will be no consequences for the U.S. rogue regime because the U.S. has veto power in the UN Security Council, so Washington doesn't care about international law, and it certainly doesn't care about human rights and sovereignty. And to be clear, I should stress that obviously this policy did not start under Donald Trump. The U.S. empire has been desperately trying to overthrow the Cuban government ever since the revolution in 1959. In 1961, the CIA organized a failed invasion known as Bay of Pigs. And back in 1960, just 1 year after the revolution, some U.S. State Department officials admitted what their strategy was. In a declassified cable, they acknowledged that the majority of Cubans supported the revolutionary leader Fidel Castro, and therefore the U.S. empire concluded that, quote, the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship, end quote. Then they went on explaining what the intention of the illegal U.S. sanctions and embargo against Cuba was. The intention was, quote, every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba, end quote. That has been their goal for more than 60 years, weaken the economic life of Cuba. And they went on writing that their goal is to, quote, make the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government, end quote. That has been the explicitly stated policy of the U.S. empire for more than 60 years. And this is exactly what the Trump administration is doing today. Of course, this is not a new policy, but the Trump administration has taken it to a whole new level, imposing a fuel blockade of Cuba to try to crush the entire country and starve 11 million people. In fact, corporate media outlets in the U.S. that are owned by billionaire oligarchs, like the Washington Post, which is owned by Jeff Bezos, one of the richest billionaire oligarchs on earth, the founder of Amazon, They are openly boasting that, quote, Cuba is collapsing. That's an opportunity for Trump, end quote. They are proud of the fact that they are barbaric medieval savages who are starving 11 million people to try to overthrow their government. The US government wants the Cuban people to suffer. That is literally the goal. They're not hiding it in any way. The US State Department posted on its official Facebook profile a video of Secretary of State Marco Rubio being asked in Congress about regime change, and he said, "We would love to see regime change in Cuba." They are proud of it. Now, Marco Rubio is extremely influential in the current US regime. He's the second most powerful official after Donald Trump. He's much more powerful than Vice President J.D. Vance, because Rubio is not only the Secretary of State, the head of US foreign policy, he's simultaneously acting as the US National Security Advisor, that is the head of the National Security Council. Rubio is only the second person in US history to simultaneously hold both positions after the notorious war criminal Henry Kissinger. So Rubio has been given extreme power to oversee US foreign policy. And Rubio is a lifelong extreme neoconservative war hawk who has obediently supported every single US war of aggression, and he is especially obsessed with overthrowing the revolutionary Cuban government. This is a lifelong personal obsession for him. He is the children of wealthy right-wing Cuban immigrants who voluntarily moved to Florida, although he has lied about it. Earlier in his career, he claimed for a long time that his parents were supposed refugees of communism who supposedly fled Fidel Castro, which was a total lie. His parents were very wealthy and they voluntarily moved to Florida before the victory of the Cuban Revolution in 1959. And the community that Rubio is from in Miami, Florida, is the heart of the far-right, corrupt Cuban oligarchs, the elites, some of whom were slave owners and big landlords, and they worked with the mafia, and they moved to Miami, Florida, and previously they worked closely with the corrupt right-wing dictator of Cuba, Fulgencio Batista, who is a US puppet who ruled Cuba with an iron fist, with a brutal dictatorship, and he had a very close relationship with the mafia. And Rubio is linked to some of these crime networks in Miami, Florida. By the way, Rubio lived with his brother-in-law, who was a prolific cocaine trafficker, a drug lord, who was imprisoned for trafficking drugs. And then after Rubio's drug trafficking brother-in-law was released from prison, Rubio used his political position to lobby for his brother-in-law to get a real estate license, which is very difficult for convicted felons and narco traffickers. And this earned Marco Rubio the nickname Narco Rubio. And Rubio has also earned that nickname because he's very close to corrupt right-wing drug trafficking politicians across Latin America, including, for instance, Rubio is a close ally of Álvaro Uribe, the corrupt former president of Colombia. And US intelligence agencies have admitted that Uribe is one of the worst Colombian drug traffickers in modern history, who worked very closely with the Medellin cartel and Pablo Escobar. And not just that, Marco Rubio is also a close political ally of the right-wing former dictator of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernández. And in fact, Rubio is one of the people who convinced Donald Trump to pardon this convicted drug dealer, one of the worst drug traffickers in modern history, Hernández, who was released from a US prison because Trump freed him. So Narco Rubio is overseeing US foreign policy, and he and the Miami Mafia are desperate to get control of Cuba once again so they can exploit the country and turn it into a new Epstein Island for US elites. They've been trying to do this for decades, and they think that now, with Donald Trump in the White House, this is the perfect opportunity.